The Fairmont San Francisco opened in 1907, 1 year after the earthquake that destroyed the building that was supposed to open in 1906. The original structure had been completed and was days from its inaugural reception when the April earthquake reduced most of the city to rubble and fire. The shell survived. The interior did not. The Fairmont reopened exactly 1 year later, rebuilt at a cost that exceeded the original construction budget by a multiple that the ownership had not planned for and could not comfortably absorb. The pattern established in that first year has not meaningfully changed in the century since. The Fairmont San Francisco sits atop Nob Hill at the corner of California and Mason Streets, occupying a position that its original developer, Tessie Fair Ulrichs, had selected specifically for its visual dominance over the city below. The building commands views of the bay, the financial district, and the neighborhoods that stretch from the waterfront to the Mission. It is the most architecturally prominent hotel in a city that has never lacked for architecturally prominent hotels. It is also, in the forensic record of its ownership history, one of the most consistently over-leveraged hospitality assets in the western United States. A building whose cultural authority has repeatedly allowed its successive owners to borrow against a valuation that its operating cash flows have never been able to sustain. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between the building's seismic history and its financial history, because the two are not separable. Every significant earthquake event in the Bay Area since 1906 has required the Fairmont's ownership to make capital investment decisions under conditions of financial stress. And every significant capital investment decision has been made by an ownership structure carrying more debt than the hotel's operations could service in normal market conditions. The building has survived every seismic event. The financial structures around it have not always survived the cost of that survival. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake is the forensic anchor of this case, not because it destroyed the Fairmont, it did not, but because the post-earthquake renovation it required arrived at precisely the moment when the hotel's then current ownership was already operating at the outer edge of its financial capacity. The earthquake did not cause the financial collapse, it revealed it. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Fairmont San Francisco's ownership history between 1945 and the present involves three distinct ownership structures, each of which acquired the asset at a premium to its operating value, financed that premium with debt the operations could not service in stress conditions, and eventually transferred the asset under circumstances that reflected financial distress rather than commercial optimization. The pattern is precise enough to constitute a forensic finding in its own right. The Fairmont San Francisco has been sold under financial pressure at least twice in its post-war history, and the current ownership structure carries the accumulated debt of those transactions in a capital stack that independent analysts have characterized as among the most complex in the American luxury hospitality sector. The covenant that no ownership has read carefully enough is the one written into the building's seismic position. The Fairmont sits on Nob Hill, which is bedrock, a seismically superior position relative to the filled land of the financial district and the marina district that amplified the Loma Prieta earthquake's damage in 1989. Bedrock position provided the Fairmont with structural protection that its neighbors on softer ground did not have. It did not provide the ownership with financial protection from the cost of post-earthquake retrofitting, which the California Building Code increasingly required for structures of the Fairmont's age and occupancy classification regardless of their underlying geology. The Loma Prieta earthquake of October 17, 1989, caused sufficient structural concern at the Fairmont to require a seismic retrofit program that the then ownership, a private group that had acquired the hotel in the mid-1980s at the peak of the San Francisco luxury hospitality market, could not fund from its operating cash flows. The retrofit was estimated at a cost that, combined with the deferred maintenance the private ownership had accumulated since acquisition, exceeded the hotel's debt service capacity by a margin that made refinancing on acceptable terms impossible in the post-earthquake credit environment of the early 1990s. The specific covenant failure came not as a single missed payment, but as a gradual deterioration of the debt service coverage ratio below the threshold required by the primary credit facility, a threshold that had been written for normal operating conditions, and that the combination of seismic retrofit costs and post-earthquake tourism disruption made unachievable regardless of the ownership's operational competence. At what point does a building's seismic position become a financial liability that belongs on the balance sheet rather than in the engineering report? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that has governed the Fairmont San Francisco's successive acquisition transactions shares a structural deficiency with the appraisals documented in the Plaza, Fontainebleau, and Waldorf cases in this channel's archive. The systematic underpricing of a specific category of capital expenditure obligation that is visible in the building's physical and regulatory record, but absent from the revenue-based valuation models that lenders and buyers have consistently applied to the asset. In the Fairmont's case, that category is seismic retrofit and ongoing structural compliance cost. California's building code requirements for seismic performance have been strengthened repeatedly since 1971, with each legislative cycle adding retrofit obligations for older structures that were not designed to meet the standards that subsequent seismic research established as necessary for life safety. The Fairmont, as a pre-1910 structure of significant height and occupancy, has been subject to successive retrofit requirements that have generated capital expenditure obligations in each decade since the 1970s. Those obligations have been known at each point of acquisition because they are matters of public regulatory record. They have been systematically underweighted in the appraisal models that have justified each successive acquisition price. The underweighting follows a predictable pattern. The appraisal capitalizes the hotel's stabilized net operating income at a rate that reflects the trophy asset premium of a Nob Hill address. It then applies a discount for known deferred maintenance and identified retrofit obligations. The discount is calculated as the present value of the retrofit cost amortized over the expected holding period of the new ownership. That calculation treats the retrofit cost as a one-time capital event rather than as a recurring obligation that California's evolving seismic standards will continue to generate for the life of the building. The error is not in the arithmetic. It is in the assumption that seismic compliance is a problem that can be solved once. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake demonstrated, with the precision of a natural experiment, that the assumption was incorrect. The retrofit program it required was not the conclusion of the Fairmont's seismic compliance story. It was an episode in a continuing story whose next chapter will be written by the next significant Bay Area seismic event, at a cost that the current appraisal methodology is almost certainly underweighting by the same margin that every previous appraisal methodology has underweighted it. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Fairmont San Francisco was acquired by Maritz, Wolff and Company in 1992 out of the financial distress that the Loma Prieta retrofit program had accelerated. Maritz Wolff held the asset through the 1990s recovery of the San Francisco luxury hospitality market and sold it to a Saudi Arabian investment group in 2003 at a price that reflected the peak of the pre-financial crisis trophy asset market. That transaction established a new debt basis for the asset that the hotel's operations would be required to service through the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath. The architecture of denial in the Fairmont's ownership history is not located in any single transaction. It is distributed across the entire sequence of acquisitions, each of which repeated the same fundamental error, treating the Fairmont's cultural authority and its Nob Hill address as sufficient justification for an acquisition price that its operating cash flows could not support under stress conditions. Each ownership has believed that its acquisition would be different from the previous one, not because the capital structure was different, but because the market environment at the time of acquisition was more favorable than the market environment that had produced the previous ownership's distress. That belief has been consistently wrong. Not because the Fairmont is a poorly managed hotel, but because the capital structures placed on it have been consistently sized for peak market performance rather than for the stress conditions that a seismically active city, a cyclical luxury travel market, and a century-old physical plant will inevitably produce. The Fairmont has operated at exceptional service standards under each of its ownership structures. Its management has not been the problem. Its balance sheet has been the problem, and the balance sheet has been the problem in the same specific way across 3 ownership cycles. Too much debt, priced for the wrong scenario, held by an ownership whose financial capacity to absorb a stress event was exhausted before the stress event arrived. The current ownership, Niku Hotel Group, which acquired the Fairmont San Francisco in 2019, entered the asset with a capital structure that was tested almost immediately by the COVID-19 pandemic's elimination of San Francisco's convention and tourism market, the 2 revenue streams that the Fairmont's operating model depends on most heavily. The test produced the predictable result. The Fairmont San Francisco closed temporarily during the COVID-19 pandemic and was subsequently converted to serve as emergency housing for homeless individuals under a San Francisco City program, a use that generated significant local controversy and that the current ownership has characterized as a temporary arrangement necessitated by the pandemic's elimination of the hotel's conventional revenue base. The hotel has since resumed partial hospitality operations, but its return to full competitive operation in the San Francisco luxury market has been complicated by the broader structural challenges facing the city's downtown hospitality sector, which has experienced occupancy and rate pressure from the persistent reduction in convention and business travel that followed the pandemic. The Fairmont's current financial condition has been the subject of reporting that has documented ongoing debt service challenges, deferred renovation investment, and a competitive position in the San Francisco luxury market that has weakened relative to newer properties that have entered the market without the capital structure legacy of multiple distressed acquisition cycles. The building is not in bankruptcy as of the time this episode was produced. It is in the condition that this channel's forensic framework has learned to recognize across 8 case files: technically operational, financially stressed, and carrying a capital structure that requires a market environment the current market is not providing. What the Fairmont San Francisco case reveals about the broader pattern of institutional collapse that this channel documents is the specific compounding risk that seismic geography imposes on historic hospitality assets in earthquake country. Every other case file in this archive documents a building whose physical structure was the stable element and whose financial structure was the variable that failed. The Fairmont documents a building where the physical structure is itself a recurring source of unplanned capital expenditure, creating a compounding liability that each successive appraisal methodology has treated as bounded, and each successive seismic event has demonstrated is not. The building opened 1 year after an earthquake destroyed what should have been its inaugural week. It has been rebuilding, refinancing, and reconstituting ever since. The marble that survived 1906 is still there. So is the debt structure that treating that marble as sufficient collateral for whatever the next owner needed to borrow has consistently produced. If this case file changed how you evaluate seismic risk in historic hospitality asset underwriting, subscribe to this channel because the next case examines a building that a government guaranteed and a market abandoned. And in the comments, given the Fairmont's documented history of seismic retrofit costs arriving at moments of peak financial stress, what specific underwriting adjustment would adequately price the compounding seismic liability of a pre-1910 structure in an active fault zone? The case file is open.